and this is part 4. We're in Chapter 17, SEM II, Confirmatory Factor Analysis. This is part 4 of my video series. Last video we had left off, we were on page 14 toward the bottom. Toward the bottom of page 14, we have the section headed Correlations Between the Factors. Having shown that the measurement model is acceptable, Dr. O'Day now turns her attention to the results that are of greatest interest to the reader, the correlations between the latent factors. Correlations between latent factors. Table 17.3 presents correlations between the 6 factors investigated in the current study. Each factor in the table is a latent factor as estimated in confirmatory factor analysis. Then on page 15, we go to this big table. Table 17.3, correlations among the latent factors estimated in confirmatory factor analysis, decimals omitted. We have a standard-looking correlation matrix. Under the heading factor, factor 1 is exercise behavior, factor 2 is health motivation, factor 3 is dislike of exercise. The columns are headed with the same numbers. This column, column 1, represents exercise behavior. This column, column 2, represents health motivation, and so forth. But what exactly are we referring to? Well, think about that handout that I sent to everybody in my class. Everybody in my class, I sent a handout, P400 additional exhibits for Chapter 17. On the first page of that handout, we had the confirmatory factor analytic model that Dr. O'Day was going to investigate. The ovals in this model represent the underlying factors that she wanted to study. One of them was exercise behavior, one of them was health motivation, and so forth. At the beginning of this video series, I said that the curved double-headed arrows represent simple correlations between the factors. There must be some kind of correlation between exercise behavior and lack of time for exercise. It is represented by this curved double-headed arrow. Confirmatory factor analysis actually computes that correlation. In fact, it computes correlation that represents each of the curved double-headed arrows we see in this figure. So let's go back to the chapter. We're on page 15, table 17.3. Here we have the correlations. The first factor was exercise behavior, and this column will provide us with the correlation between that factor, exercise behavior factor, and each of the other factors studied in the confirmatory factor analysis. Under the column headed 1, we see that the correlation between exercise behavior and health motivation was 0.35, positive 0.35. In the same column, the correlation between exercise behavior and dislike of exercise is negative 0.43, and so forth. Dr. O'Day refers to this. I refer to this in the next bit of text. One objective of the current study was to identify the factors that display the strongest correlations with exercise behavior factor, the first latent variable that was listed in table 17.3. Table shows that the exercise behavior factor displayed the strongest correlations with lack of time for exercise. The correlation was negative 0.52. Is that true? Let's see, the first column is exercise behavior. Yes, the strongest correlation was with lack of time for exercise, negative 0.52 right there. Showed the strongest correlations with lack of time for exercise, negative 0.52, dislike of exercise, negative 0.43, and health motivation, positive 0.35. The exercise behavior factor displayed the weakest correlation with the desire to be thin factor. The correlation was just 0.16. Is that true? Yes. Correlation between exercise behavior and desire to be thin was just 0.16. This is going to be the table that the researcher is most interested in. Most wants to determine what are the variables that show strong correlations with exercise behavior. What are the variables that show weak correlations with exercise behavior? We've now identified them. What does the chapter go on to say? Summary of findings, and this once again is on page 15. Summary of findings. Measurement model illustrated in figure 17.1, and yes, that was the first figure that I showed you in the handout that I gave to all my students. It also appeared earlier in the chapter. Measurement model illustrated in figure 17.1, presented much earlier in this chapter, provided an acceptable fit to the data. In short, results from this confirmatory factor analysis suggest that Dr. O'Day's 6-factor measurement model displays a good fit to the data and acceptable psychometric properties. This means that she's completed step 1 of Anderson and Gerbing's proposed 2-step procedure for testing causal models with latent variables. In step 2, she will modify the factor model that's presented in figure 17.1. That is, she will modify this model. She will modify the model presented in figure 17.1 so that it proposes causal relationships between some of the latent factors. She'll then perform path analysis with latent factors to assess the fit of the resulting causal model. These results will be presented in Chapter 18. What is this text talking about? Dr. O'Day found good support for this measurement model. She used confirmatory factor analysis. She got good support for this measurement model. She'll now modify it. She'll get rid of some of the curved double-headed arrows that represent simple correlations and replace some of them with straight single-headed arrows that represent causal effects. In other words, she'll modify this measurement model so that it becomes this path model. This is also in the handout that I gave to students in my class. At the top it says, following figures on page 4 of Chapter 18, SEM III, Path Analysis with Latent Factors. She'll get rid of some of the curved double-headed arrows, replace them with the straight single-headed causal arrows, and then she'll be able to perform path analysis with latent factors to see if there's good support for the hypothesized causal relationships proposed here. Is there good support for the idea that exercise behavior is actually causally determined by health motivation and dislike of exercise? Is there evidence to support the idea that health motivation is causally determined by desire to be thin and current health? Questions like that will be answered in Chapter 18. Now, this semester, we're not going to cover Chapter 18 in my class, but you do have Chapter 18, and you are welcome to read ahead, see what's presented in Chapter 18, and you'll see that it's pretty much just a combination of the basic concepts that you learned in Chapter 16, path analysis, combined with the concepts in this chapter, Chapter 17, confirmatory factor analysis. Once you have Chapter 16, Chapter 17 under your belt, you'll find it a fairly easy step to move on to Chapter 18 and understand path analysis with latent factors. That is the subject of Chapter 18, and I have a note to myself to stop lecturing here, and this will be the last of the current video series on Chapter 17, SEM II, Confirmatory Factor Analysis.